Hi everyone, this is Kelly and I am here to do a video request, which is to talk about or go through my Fae deck. So I have several videos now that say go through my shamanic animistic style decks, I think I did a goddess one, and I feel like there's another, animal decks. I have all my animal decks. And I need to do one on botanical decks. I'm kind of, as I was doing this, I was kind of pulling those decks out. But the one that was requested was for fairy or fae type decks. And so if you want to kind of see my idea of Fae and my thoughts on Fae energy and things like that, we did last week in live chat. I've been doing live chats with the first hour on a theme, and then the second hour is more just random chit chat. So I'll try to remember to link that below. You can just watch the first portion of that. Eventually I do want to do a more precise video on Fae, fairy, and Fae energy, but that at least kind of points you in the direction of which I am coming from. So I'll put that in the description box below. But again, the request was fairy deck. So I pulled out, I'm sorry, my allergies are really acting up, and so I apologize if my voice gets a little bit funny, but I pulled out all my decks. I have some more over here, and some of my favorites are over here. Just trying to figure out how to kind of group them in some way or approach them in some fashion to sort of bring, kind of work our way through them. So we'll just kind of dive in. I'm going to start with this pile because this is a little bit easier, because this is probably more on the edge of what maybe people would put into this category of Fae or fairy decks. Now, as I said, let me just one clarification that I will make. I personally, and this is just personal labeling, but I do think part of the issue that we need to have when having conversations about just about anything is to have a clarification of words and what we're talking about with words. So for me, there is a difference between fairy, F-A-I-R-Y. Do I have a deck that says that? These actually used for me the spelling that I wouldn't use for those particular decks. But anyways, actually quite a few of these do. So for me, the fairy decks, such as F-A-I-R-Y, fairy, are along the lines of what happened when the Victorian period came into being. And so there was in a nutshell, the move towards industrialization created a place in which people were romanticizing about the good old days when it was just a green forest full of fairies, and their fairies were very much more along the lines of very similar setups to human existence, but little tiny beautiful fairies with wings. And so we see lots of images of these in paintings. I think this is I believe, the Victorian Fairy Tarot. I used to have a set with the book and everything. I just have a copy of the deck currently, but where you have little tiny beings that look fairly similar, exactly similar, maybe with pointy ears. They have little butterfly wings. This is a very typical Victorian-esque. You can even see this looks like a very Victorian setting, and so this was a style of fairy. This is actually a great little deck here. I don't want to say little deck because that seems condescending. It's actually has some really neat things within this particular deck, and I have a walkthrough, not of all of the decks that you're going to see, but I do have walkthroughs on a lot of them. But this is certainly a perfect representation of sort of Victorian fairies, Fairy. So I kind of differentiate those types of fairies. Nothing wrong with them. They are of an era. They are what I think of more as fairy tales and fairies in this era. And then there is, for me, something different in the term, which I would use the term Fae, Fae, or even fairy, Faerie. But certainly Fae energy to me is less, I mean, they interlock, right? They intermingle. So I'm not saying they're completely separate, but they are a separate, very deep, very old, into the forest, into the burrows, under the earth, connected in many ways to ancestral energy, and even having a line crossing between that and ghosts of people who have passed on, things of that nature. That energy for me is very important to my path, and it's different than fairy tales and fairies, which is also something that is very important to me and to my path. So, but I do differentiate between those two divisions in some way. What this deck represents are fables, and to some degree fairy tales and fables, and so that doesn't mean that there's always fairies in the way that we might think of fairies, but it is the kind of woodsy fables and myths and stories, which is of these my absolute two favorites. Well, all of these are favorites, so to be honest, but this does have trolls in it and things of that nature. I actually do think that the John Bower Tarot fits very firmly into Fae and Fairy. You're talking about what's in the forest, what stands at the edge between the light and the dark of the forest, what stands in the caves, these types of energies. And the can we just pause? The John Bower is literally one of my all-time favorite decks, but it is also would be one of my favorite, what I would consider to be Fae decks, but it also definitely crosses into fables, which is something that I absolutely love. It doesn't always have fairies in it. So that's the John Bower. The Rackham Tarot as well is that fairy tales and a little bit closer to fairy tales, fables and myths and things of that nature, just obviously not from Sweden like the John Bower is. But this still has that energy of the tales, of storytelling in such, but this, and it does very much have Fae creatures in it. Absolutely. I haven't had this deck as long as the John Bower. I love it close to the John Bower, but for me, the John Bower is slightly ahead. Of course, I've had a lot of reading experience with the John Bower, which certainly puts it, I haven't done a walkthrough yet of this. I haven't had it too long. This kind of is just a beautiful representation, a bit of that Victorian style, but just done in such a way that just speaks to my storytelling heart. So this does have Fae and Fairy in it, so I do believe it counts as a fairy deck. It's just that straddling of the lines, but I absolutely love these decks in terms of fairy and fae and fable and storytelling. Of course, these were illustrators for those types of fairy tale books and fable books and things of that nature, so it makes sense, right? Love these. The Bohemian Gothic I had to put in here, even though this is not a fairy deck, but it is again, storytelling, the old stories of vampires and demons and werewolves and Frankenstein, and like the walkthrough for this deck is actually one of my personal favorite walkthroughs. this deck brings me so much joy because it gets at the heart of, again, those liminal spaces, werewolves that stand at the liminal space between animal and men, vampires too that stand at the space between the living and the dead, Frankenstein, this, you know, we're humans or are we trying to play God? These kinds of powerful spaces are very Fae spaces, very liminal spaces, which for me, witches, you know, stand at the liminal spaces. So this is a deck of liminal spaces, and for me, Fae energy. If I had to describe Fae energy, one of the key words would be this idea of what stands in the liminal spaces. And so while this doesn't have any traditional Fae creatures such as fairies or elves or things of that nature, it still stands in the storytelling liminal spaces that are very powerful. And so I had to include it, even though I would not call this a fairy deck, just to be clear. The Fairytale Tarot, of course, by Baba Studios. This is straight right in the realm of fairy tales and fables. I left some of the cards in there. But so you're not, you know, you've got giants here. I don't think you've got some elvins and fairy creatures and things. This is, you know, definitely in the realm of fairy tale, which is so powerful. I just read an article last night about these fabulists. I'm not sure what they were, literary people who had conducted a study trying to trace like some of the Grimm brothers, fables and fairy tales and things of that nature, to try to figure out how old these stories are. And they did it, of course, many of these, in fact, all were at one point oral traditions, which makes it almost impossible, right? I would argue probably impossible to really know. But what they did is followed sort of genealogical branches of language, so that if two countries or two languages held the same story, you know, variations, but held the same story, they would trace those two languages back to its original language, like where it split off from, because it was sharing the same stories, but in different languages. So where's the language root, right? And being able to sort of trace story, they narrowed it down to about 75 or 76 stories that they could kind of trace the language roots back. And because, you know, I'm just going to start geeking out here a little bit, but it's story and language go together, right? When you think about Tolkien and doing the Lord of the Rings, he was a linguist. What he was interested in was language, but he understood or believed that at the heart of language are the stories and the traditions. And so much of what he wrote, of which we have not seen all of it, right? He wrote tons of things. But what he wrote was to create the backgrounds and the stories so that the language could develop. I mean, it's just really fantastic. So anyways, given that, it was so interesting to see them follow sort of the language roots back, and their you know, hypothesis, and it's just a hypothesis, but their hypothesis is that some of these stories are 6,000 years old, not from the 1500s, but 6,000 years old. Of course, they would have shifted and changed across that time period. But it's interesting. Again, I don't think it's anything that can ever be proven, but it is interesting because I do believe that these stories that keep being repeated across different cultures and variations have been around far longer than the pieces of paper that we still have. And you know, they are part of what I consider story with a capital S, which is the story. And this is the myths, the fairy tales, the fables, the folklore, the gods, the goddesses. All of that to me is story with a capital S. It is the way in which the source, spirit, divine, whatever you want to call that existence, is played out over and over again as human beings express these bigger cycles and these bigger shifts and changes. It's just beautiful. Anyways, that's the Fairy Tale Tarot by Baba Studios. This is out of print. They put it back into print for a limited run where because they had a bunch of decks missing a single card. They replaced the single card and sold the decks, but you can't currently get this. You'd have to find it out of print. I promised myself if it ever came into print, I would buy it, even though it's pricey, and I did, and I have no regrets. So that's the Fairy Tale. And then to go with the Rackham Tarot, this is one I've had for a while. This is the Rackham Oracle. There is a couple tarot. There's a Ring Cycle Tarot. I have a playing card deck on the Ring Cycle with Rackham's artwork. There is a newer Rackham Tarot that doesn't have any words on it. This one, I can't even remember the name of the person who does this. I believe it's still for sale. There are problems with, I know that a lot of people have with the creator of this deck that I didn't know anything about at the time, and I still don't know a lot about it. I think there are some decks that are very problematic that he has created. So that's something you'll have to do your own research into. But I do, as a deck, standing alone from its creator, I do really love this deck. I love the words that are chosen and used. Obviously, I love the artwork of Rackham's artwork. And so I do really love this particular deck. But again, you'll have to do your due diligence to figure out whether that's something that you want to purchase or not. So these are definitely absolute favorites. These are in my cubicle that I have of favorite decks, and I absolutely love them. And so they are on that story, fable, folklore side of things in a beautiful and powerful way. I'm not quite sure how to do this here. I'm going to talk about these two decks, I guess, really quickly, because I do think these two decks straddle the world between what I think of as Fae and Fairy. They are definitely in a little bit more in the realm of Fairy, with lots of little tiny Fae creatures with wings, but they are, to me, they have that energy of Fae, of the dark of the forest, of into the woods and in the loamy branches and in the shadows and things of that nature. And there's a powerful energy to them versus a bright, light, sweet, bright energy that I would think of with sort of fairy tales and fairies of the Victorian period, was much more light filled, right? These two feel as if, yes, they still kind of belong there, but they're at they're at the woods at the bottom of the garden, right? So you had all those wonderful pictures that were, some people believe were fraud, some people don't believe were flawed, but you kind of associate at the bottom of an English garden, where the garden gives way into a forest, right? Those woodsy areas, that's where these feel like they take place. And I really love both of these decks for that. So the one is Tarot of the Secret Forest. This was given to me, and feeling that I would really love it, and definitely correct. I have not used this deck a lot, but I have had very powerful personal readings with it. This is a deck, I have a walkthrough of this. This is a deck that has the original sketching on the back and then the finished painting on the front. And so it is very interesting sometimes to see the shifts and the changes there. But it definitely has the sort of insect, like you can see really clearly here, this creature with a scorpion tail, but embracing what seems to be maybe a human on one side. And so these are just, they feel like you're in the forest, even though I think that most of these, there's a mer creature there surrounding fish, or at least a water nymph or dryad or something. This beautiful old tree with the face, with the big ponderous limbs and roots that you could just see walking across the forest, right? Most are tiny, like riding bugs and bees and things of that nature. There's like a giant like caterpillar here. So very insecty. I love this fox. This is a beautiful 3 of Wands. Riding lizards, riding insects and beetles and flowers. So it's very much sort of the wild garden and the woodsy garden. It's really quite a stunning deck. And again, this is a deck I have used for myself. And had some just really powerful experiences with it. But it's certainly not one I would say that I've used a lot as yet, but it's very powerful. It is something I will be continuing to work with. It's not in my favorites of all time yet, only because I just haven't used it a lot. But I have a feeling that this will end up in that category at some point. So that is the Tarot of the Secret Forest. This is the Circle of Life Tarot. Now, I had this twice. I had this once long ago before I had very many decks. It was in a different iteration. It was Circle, but it had a bunch of different languages around it, and I just never really liked that. They put it out again. I think this is Los Scarabeo. Yes. They put it out again maybe 2 years ago, I'm guessing here. I'm bad with time. Without all of those languages. And I'm really glad that they did. This has a very, again, Fae feeling to it. Fae almost, and I'm saying alien not as in aliens from other planets, but it does have this feeling of other, right? This doesn't feel like little humans that just have wings. They feel like creatures. You know, look at that. Her leg turns into a claw. Like there is definitely the feeling of other here, that this is other energy. And it's really quite beautiful. I love that card. I need to leave this out and use it a little bit more. My spreads and things that I tend to do don't always lend themselves to circle decks. It's not something I use a lot, but there is something about this deck I think that is really beautiful. And again, in its otherness, it could make you think, I think, from a quick glance that this would be in the realm of like the Victorian flower fairy or something like that. But there is definitely a sense of other and fayness to this deck that you don't always get in decks that I think is, I mean, look, that's one of my favorite cards. This is definitely, I think, one to explore if you're interested in a round deck, and if you're interested in, look at the backings, and then I edged one of my favorite edgings actually, because it's literally in person, it's perfect. Like there is an absolute perfect match to the edging. I have a walkthrough of this, and I probably say what I used. I don't remember anymore, but it is literally like a perfect edging to me. It's one of my pride and joys in terms of coloring the sides. So that's that one. So again, these two could feel like they're lending towards fairy, but I do think there is a powerful otherness that lends it straight into the realm of fae. And again, those are classifications. Don't, I'm sure I'm going to get messages saying, wah. But those are just classifications for me. It lets me try to explain or make sense of that there is a difference between fairy tales and fairy, Victorian fairy type energies than the old stories and the old energy of the fae. And that's just how I differentiate them. You are not going to, you can't rely on this for titles. As you will see, fairy, I've got a couple over here, I think, that have it. So you can't really rely on it being in the title itself. It's just something that I happened to focus on. Another one that I do feel kind of straddles the lines of decks is the Hezekiah's Tarot. And I do have a walkthrough on this. This was a really pleasant surprise because I think that on glance it feels like it may be sweet and childlike, but it's actually really deep. The court cards are all sort of bust like this and close-faced, and so you have these court of, some of them are side-faced too, but it's kind of that viewpoint is there. The majors are, I think, really powerful. Love this strength card. It's definitely Rider-Waite-Smith in creation, but it is definitely, there's a whole suit, and this is what probably would have, this was sent to me quite a long time ago. I probably wouldn't have purchased this deck because I'm not a super fan. I love that Judgment card. I'm not a big fan of like gnomes. I mean, it is part of Fae and fairytale and these types of things, but I'm just not personally a fan of like garden gnome-y type feel. And there's a whole, the coin suit, well, even obviously the rods, the numbers are, there's a lot of little gnomes and things in them. But it's just, this one, I don't know. And you can see that sort of, that is for the Six of Rods, which makes sense, the Six of Wands. This sort of childhood thing here. So there is something sweet, and I think some of it's to do perhaps with even just the artwork. So this is definitely in the realm, for me, of fairy tale. Again, not a bad thing. I love fairy tales. I've spent my life loving fairy tales. But this is definitely in the realm of fairy and fairy tales. However, there's something about these solid people that you feel like these are Picts and Celts and things of that nature of old. I mean, look at that devil. It's not a fluffy deck or a sweet deck. It reads quite powerfully, and I think it's the melding of, you have sort of the more fairy creatures in the numbers. You have a solid human sort of element, powerful human element to the courts. And then you have, I think, more of that Fae feeling with the majors, and certainly a sense of power. And there's just something about that blending. I mean, who does not want to look at this card and sing about Puff Magic Dragon? There's just something very sweet about the style and the artwork that makes you think, oh, this is a sweet deck, it's cute, that kind of thing. But there's an underlying power to this deck and the readings. I mean, that's a hard that's a hard 10 of swords, because you kind of follow this little gnome like on this story, it kind of feels like, and then he's like dead and impaled. So it's not, you know, this is not a deck for children by any means. And I really love that juxtaposition between fairy tale. So again, it kind of stands at the middle ground between those fairy tales and then those deeper tales that are there. That the creator of this, I think, has done something really special with this particular deck that I would have missed just because I would have assumed, and this is a problem with assumptions, right? You know what they say about assumptions. So that one kind of, to me, also straddles that space. Now, I'm really I'm trying to make rhyme or reason of this, but I'm not. It's a kind of, it's a bit of a jumble. There's a lot of decks that, you know, trying to get a reasoning for why I'm jumbling them together, putting them in a certain way. These are decks that are very, for me, fully into fairy, Fairy, kind of sweet fairy, Victorian fairy. But well, on this one, I absolutely love this deck. This is the Magical Times Empowerment cards by Jody Bergsma. Now, part of it is that I absolutely love her artwork. And again, these are not meant to be reviews. I'm not showing all of the cards. I have walkthroughs on a lot of these, and this is one I I'm pretty sure I have a walkthrough on. These are definitely fae and dragons, and they're just beautiful and natural creatures. There are some degree of like maybe more angelic energy, but there's these amazing fire dragons and this fae riding a dragon. Like this one stands, I guess, a little bit more. I mean, I think these two would actually, I'm gonna have to try to do a reading with these two, because I actually think this kind of is similar in that there's something here more than just pretty pictures. Again, I'm really a fan of dragons and animals, and you have a lot of really powerful dragons in here. Love that card. And there is an animal component to all of Jody Bergsma's art that really shows up here. There is a sense of divinity in some of the cards as well. So this, I think, is a beautiful example of a deck that I probably, if I'd seen it on a shelf, I bought this, I think, on Amazon, and again, I bought it because I really needed this energy of a specific deck. This was one of my December deck purchases, so Decembers are really hard for me because that's the month that my son died in, and so I do tend to get a deck that I think is going to support me, and they do often tend to lean towards inner child support work. That seems to really help in those months, and I bought this for that specific purpose, and it really is beautiful. I absolutely love this particular deck for that energy. This is similar to the Magical Times, and this, I don't have a box for this. This is, I want to say it's Wild Wisdom of the Fairy. I should have looked it up. Wait, let me look if I can find the guidebook. 1 second. My guidebooks are a little crazy at the moment. I definitely need to rearrange and try to alphabet. Maybe I don't have a guidebook for this. I'm not sure. If somebody knows, and they can put it into the comments, and I'll try to pin it there. If I don't remember to look it up, please just leave me a nice comment to remember. By the time I edit things and put it up, sometimes oftentimes I forget. I know that. I know it's frustrating, but just kindly remind me, and I'll try to find it. This is. It feels very Victorian fairy, lots of beautiful people with butterfly type wings. But it is lovely, right? This definitely feels like fairy tale, like this Catch Me card with all of the birds. Like it feels like fairy tale. So this is a deck I actually do really love for that fairy tale feel to it. I do, again, wish there was some more male fairy energy. There is some. I'm not saying there isn't, but it does feel predominantly female. This kind of feels like Amy Brown art. That kind of, if you follow fairy art at all, you probably know who I'm talking about. This isn't her art. I don't think any of these are. But it feels like fairy tales, and I love fairy tales. So I actually do like this deck quite a bit. Now there are 2 versions of this. Again, I've got to walk through. I will very much try to, because I'm going to put this where I hopefully won't forget it. There are 2 versions of it. I love this version and this back version here. Because this is a Blue Angel deck, and I think there's a difference. There's an Australian version and perhaps a US version that sometimes happens. So I will try to find the link to the walkthrough that talks about that a little bit more. But this is definitely fairy tale, and it works quite well as that. I'm going to stick that over there so that hopefully I will remember. So there's that one. This is the Good Tarot. Now this is not, I kind of hesitated whether to put this in here or not. This isn't billed as a fairy deck whatsoever, but it feels like fairy tale to me. It feels like, you know, the stag at the woods. There's a mermaids in here. There's a woman in the moon. You know, there is a sense of fairy tale to this. So I don't think this is billed at all. Mermaids, right? So for me, this does say fairy tale. And I actually really love this deck. It's not my favorite. It's not my favorite style of art. But I will say that I have a couple people. I have actually a friend of mine who doesn't get a lot of tarot readings or anything like that, but when I do it for her, she really loves this particular deck. And it does have a feel of fairy tale to it. So for me, this would definitely be considered a fairy deck, and it's really beautiful. It's not, again, I'm not a huge fan of photo manipulation, and sometimes it really works in here, and sometimes it doesn't work quite as much, but I do love the sense of fairy tale about this deck. And again, I have gotten some really lovely readings from it. So again, I mean, look at that. That's just gorgeous. So for me, this is firmly in the realm of fairy. I mean, this literally makes me want to use this more, because I do think there is something here. I love that one. Look at that Queen of Earth. I do love that. So yeah, so again, I don't think, you know, it doesn't say anything on the box about this being about fairy tales, but this to me is well in the realm of fairy tales, in that sense of stories that we tell. These are decks that to me feel very much like the Victorian fairy, and this is actually called Victorian. I keep wanting to say Victorian. It's not Victorian flower. It's just Victorian fairy tarot. And I have walkthroughs of this here, and this is really again, very sweet, but reads really beautiful deck. This is the second, I think, incarnation that I've had of this. And it's not a deck that I would get rid of. I don't use it a lot. I love Temperance using Absinthe. And I think that it's the Hangman in this one that is sniffing opium. Poppy flowers, which I love. You know, again, what I don't love as much is the very Victorian humanness that's layered onto fairy, just because, again, it's not how I see fairy. But it hits a lot of fairy, and I absolutely love this Awakening card here. So there's some great cards in this deck. If that's a style artwork you love, it's really a lovely deck. This is the Fairy Guidance Oracle by Paulina Cassidy. I have not done a walkthrough of this. Oops. But I have used this in readings. I don't use it a lot. It's very, because it kind of just feels sweet. I haven't done a walkthrough of this deck yet, and I haven't used it very much. It has that sweet sense of fairy tale about it. I'm probably going to need to close the curtains. I don't know. I'm not fully, it's not something that I reach for. It's not something I've used very much, but there is something there that is sweet that, you know, it has me liking to have it around. So I'm not sure about this one yet. Again, I have not used this enough, I think, to have a very good feeling one way or another about it. But this is a Fairy Guidance Oracle deck that is that sort of, feels like those Victorian style of fairies. This is another interesting one that I actually do want to do a walkthrough at some point. This is the Mystic Fairy Tarot. What I love about this deck, and again, not one I've used hardly at all, definitely for me in the realm of more Victorian style fairy, but what this does, I think, an amazing job at is the minor cards tell an arcing story, and I really like that aspect of this. And so again, more of the sort of Victorian style fairy, if that's the kind of artwork that you like. One of the things, and again, I think one of its points that I think it does differently than others is that sense of arcing story across the minors, similar to say what you saw in Prismavisions, where you have that whole story. Now those artistically go across as well, but it's also a story that follows through, and this does that as well. So again, because I like it, but in terms of using decks, I don't tend to lean towards that Victorian fairy style. They aren't decks that I use a lot, but I think they're good representations of that particular type of fairy tale. Make some piles over here. Make some piles over here. We talked about those. I still have more over here I have to bring in, but I'll clear the table. These are the somebody asked me in the live chat whether or not I considered mermaids to be oracles or to be fairy, and I definitely consider mermaids to be magical fae energy, selkies, and you know they're just fae and water fae, right? So I definitely do do that. I want to do an actual full-on walkthrough of the Mermaid Tarot. There's just not enough time in the day, right? I did a live unboxing of this. And it's not a perfect deck for me. It's not a perfect deck. I think it's in the Pentacles, perhaps, with... I think it's the Pentacle suit that maybe I feel like let me down the most. But there's a lot about this deck that I actually really love. And so I do want to give it a proper walkthrough because of that, because I do think there's some pretty amazing ways that she kind of rethought, especially in the majors. I really love the majors. I love a lot of the cards. I mean, that's just gorgeous. So this is a Mermaid Tarot, and I would definitely recommend this deck. Again, it's not like I love every single card, and it's not like I just am down to just maybe, oh, I love them all, but like two. There are definitely some cards that are not my favorite, but I really like the guidebook. I really like what the creator has done in a lot of the cards, especially the major arcana. I love the intensity of color. I love the way that the fire cards are amazing. And so I do think there's a lot here to say that this is, if you love mermaids, you probably would enjoy this deck. So I do need to put this in do a proper review of it, but that's a mermaid. The only other mermaid deck that I have is the Oracle of the Mermaids. I have used this actually more. I used to use it for spring and water. For me, I associate water with spring. So when I did Wheel of the Year ahead spreads, I did use this for spring, and you know, it worked really well in that capacity. This to me really pushes towards sort of romance novel-esque look. And again, I'm not opposed to Fae being powerfully and beautiful and all of that, but it just kind of, for me, pushes towards romance novel mermaids. I know that's a problematic card as well. So this is not a deck that I would say that I love. Obviously, if somebody just loves mermaids, this is one to have, but it's not my favorite. It just kind of doesn't quite do it for me. I know, I'm sure some people absolutely love this, but I don't know that there's a ton of options for mermaids, so that makes it a little bit harder, but it's not my absolute favorite, but I have used it. It's done its job. I've gotten some readings, you know, out of it in terms of using it for water, but those are the only two mermaid decks that I have, and I do consider mermaids to be fae. So, okay, let me pull. Okay, there are two other decks that I don't really have any experience with. One is called The Twilight Realm of Fairy by Beth Wilder. I don't have a walkthrough on this. I've not really used this at all. Lovely lady sent it to me. Now, they did say this used to be their favorite deck, but it just kind of fell out of use. Try to shake it out. It's a shiffer deck, so this is like the old Marielle box in some way, and the cardstock is definitely like the old Marielle. These are still in order. Like I said, I haven't done a walkthrough of this, so I don't really have much to say about these. Some of the artwork on these are really beautiful. It looks like it's in pastel pencils. Like that, I think is really gorgeous. It doesn't always look as finished as others, just in a quick glance through here. The hanged one, like she looks like she's really being hanged. But I don't have anything to offer to this other than to point it out, because I just haven't gotten around to. I do love the simple Ace of Swords, and I like that Two of Swords. Like, to me, like this spider dragony thing, I don't know, the artwork doesn't really speak to me as much as some of the other images of artwork in here. Definitely feels to be Rider-Waite-Smith based in some way. I do like that Nine of Swords. So yeah, it seems quite Rider-Waite-Smith based. So again, I don't really have anything to say about this because I have not done a walkthrough on it, and like that's Rumpelstiltskin, which I'd like, or I'm assuming so. That's pretty cool. So yeah, I just don't have really anything to add to this yet because I haven't worked with it. I do like that Two of Cups. Some of the art, as I said, is really beautiful. Some of it's I'm guessing that that's pastels. It's got that pastel look to it. Like, some of it's not as much my favorite, but people, to me, I have a hard time with people in decks. So yeah, so this is a fairy deck. That's I mean, that's just about the most that I can say about this, is that this is an option as a fairy deck. I haven't read the guidebook. I haven't done I really haven't done anything with this. She obviously had done the edges. I haven't done the edges. It's gorgeous black. I mean, that would have that black. I mean, that would almost, in my opinion, be a necessity to blacken the edges. So yeah, so there is this out there. You know, I will try to add it to my list. I just have a big, I have a big pile up of decks to do walkthroughs of, and this just simply hasn't called my name enough yet to be able to spend any time with it yet. So that's just it. That's an option. Twilight Realm of Tarot of Fairy by Beth Wilder. And this one is called the Fairy Tarot, it's a US Game Systems by Natalie Hertz. And same thing here. I don't really have anything to offer about this yet. It's cute. It feels cute, and yet some of the images are really like the Emperor is really powerful. But the art style perhaps isn't my favorite art style. I mean, that's awesome. I love that Hermit. So I just haven't. That's a really cool death. So it kind of seems like it kind of walks between something that's really cute, but I like the broken mushroom for that. The star is beautiful. It just seems to kind of walk the line between cute and that's beautiful. So I again don't have anything to offer about this because I haven't really used it. Like, that's intriguing. So it may just be, the art styles don't particularly call to me. So I just haven't gotten around to really trying to work with them or not. But this one feels a little bit more on the side of fairytale. This seems a little bit more intentional-wise to be along the lines of Fae energy. You may be able to find other walkthroughs of these. Again, eventually I'll get around to trying to do it. Like, that's beautiful. So yeah, I just haven't gotten around. I feel like I started a walkthrough of this before and never finished it. I really can't remember. So I just don't have anything to offer to you about these other than the fact that they do exist, and so that they might be something, if the art seems to speak to you, just then it might be something to look into. So I did want to at least put them out there, so to speak. So then the rest of the decks that I have are definitely favorites of mine, for one reason or another. The two here are Brian Froud's decks. Now, the Heart of Fairy, which is this one, I have videos on these, and I have a video comparison, I think, where I go into more depth as to what I think about them in comparison to each other. This was the very first oracle that I ever had, and it was right around the same time as the Celtic Tree Oracle. So those two, which is more OM, but it was definitely Oracle cards. So this I have had, and that was the only Oracle cards that I had for like 9.5 years. So I have done a lot of readings with this deck. And the full reading, there's a big reading that goes along. No, actually, I think that's I'm thinking of the Tree Fairy's got a big reading. I can't remember what reading this one has in the book. But anyways, I have done a lot of readings. A friend of mine, a next door neighbor who I learned how to read tarot and things off of her. She bought me this deck because she knows how much I love Fae. And this, I mean, this is very John Bauer. The images are gorgeous, and I would almost say I might like some of the images in this more than in this. It's hard. I mean, they're two decks. I don't have to really have one versus the other, right? But what I will say that is in terms of art of Fae creatures, for me, probably nothing really surpasses Brian Froud. I do believe he sees fairies, and he paints them. So what I will say is that when push comes to shove, as a system, because these are Oracle decks, right, and they are Oracle systems, so as a system, the Fairies Oracle, this is a Heart of Fairy and this is the Fairies Oracle. The Fairies Oracle feels more cohesively pulled together. And again, I talk a little bit more about it. I also really love the use of these elemental energies in the singers of this particular deck that I find to be very, very powerful. So if I were, and I know one of these may be out of print, I'm not entirely sure. I've heard that it was and then it wasn't. But of my favorite, like if I were to pick one, now this is not my original deck. I actually got rid of my original deck when I first started, I want to say when I first started doing professional readings. I can't remember, but I finally just thought, I just passed it on. I thought it wasn't good for me. It was very good for me for reading for myself. Both of these are. But I didn't find this one to be as good as for reading for other people. There's a kind of a trickstery nature about both of these decks. I've heard other people talk about them as well, and that they do seem to really embody some of the energy of the Fae, and that can make them interesting and a little trickstery to read with. But I loved this one. I passed this one on, and this one came back to me. I feel like it was just maybe a few months after I had passed it on, and I was like, okay, clearly I can't do that. Clearly we spent so much time together. So I will never get rid of either of these decks. But I use this one probably the most. Certainly for reading for people, I use this the most, although I spent years reading with this. But that was just pretty much for me. I think one of my sisters, I read with her this one, as well as my next door neighbor. So I did do a lot of readings with it, but it was limited in the number of people. But I just find these elemental energies so powerful in this version of in this particular one, and I just feel like the system of how the deck was put together, the structure of the deck, for me personally, feels more cohesive in this in the Fairies Oracle than the Heart of Fairy. Now that's personal opinion, and I'm sure you'll find people who will love this over that, right? But I just wanted to spend a minute on these because I actually do feel like these two decks and the images here for me just embody the Fae as a whole the most of any decks. So I think those are important to spend a moment talking about. Now, the other one that for me I just love, and I've had again for a long time, is the Tarot of the Hidden Realms. And this is a beautiful deck that speaks to the underrealms. It speaks to the Fae, probably leaning towards the Celtic Fae, I would suppose, more than anything. But there is just something about this deck that is, I don't know, it's just really beautiful and it's really powerful. The artist's use of facial expressions and body postures. I love that there's a Selkie card. I've done a lot of readings with this deck and it just feels very Fae. And I mean, I just love it. I love this deck. There's nothing that I don't love about this deck except for the Magician's Porn Stash. But, you know, we've become good friends, regardless of his porn stash. The Beckoning High Priestess. I don't know. There's just really something powerful. It's one of my favorite strength cards. Somebody sent me a print of this, and it's in my Fae Wildwood altar space there all the time. I love this Hermit. This is chipping up. You can see I've had this deck for a while. This is one of my older decks, and I've used it a lot. It's not been edged. It's got that. It's just been worn, right? It's just one of those decks that has just aged and worn. So I would say really for as much, this is old Llewellyn stock, for as much as I've used this deck and as long as I've had it, I feel like it's actually held up better than I might expect. I probably need to get a backup copy of this just because sometimes when I've had decks start to, I'm going to try to get a good example of it. It's kind of hard, but sometimes when I've had decks that start to do this kind of chipping on the edge, I've had it start to peel more where it gets to be, you know, unsightly. I don't mind this kind of wornness, but if it starts to peel up or something, then that's going to be a problem. So I probably need to get a backup deck of this because I love it so much. So that is a Fae tarot deck that I absolutely love. The other, and around, this is, I would say, arguably my second tarot deck, although I actually think I had, so my first tarot deck was the Llewellyn Tarot, which you could argue could, I guess, possibly be put into the Fae deck, although it's more in the storytelling and myth. That is the Welsh mythology. So again, the mythology, stories, tales, folk tales, fables, fairy tales, they all, for me, walk that same liminal space, right? So there's things that could arguably be in this category that I haven't added. But that was my first tarot deck. And I feel like I got the round Circle of Life tarot, but it didn't appeal to me because of all of the words that were on it. I didn't use it all that much. That may have come before the Shadowscapes. But anyways, the Shadowscapes was a deck that I bought very soon after heading out onto my own from a 23-year marriage and thinking, oh, I'm actually in a position in which I can start buying more tarot decks and having tarot decks out. And I was also, when I was thinking about doing more with tarot on a professional basis, at least it was in the back of my mind, I would say. But I wanted to study Rider-Waite-Smith. I had learned to read my particular style of reading, which is probably from a mix of the Llewellyn guidebook, and then I had a small book that used Marseille images, and Marseille, sort of a lot of number focus there, probably also affected by playing card divination I'd done before. But I wanted to at least have a solid foundation and kind of fill in the gaps of what I knew about the Rider-Waite-Smith system. And so I, went on a year or two studying of that, and I used this deck a lot. This I feel like is the primary deck that I used for about a year and a half after my son died. I was using this deck a lot. Stephanie Poo-Moon Law's artwork is stunning. This is Fae energy at its most beautiful. Definitely light colors, definitely a sense of brightness. There's depth here as well, although less, I would say perhaps a little less shadows into the woods. But it's just absolutely gorgeous. It's a deck that I often recommend for beginners. It's the deck that my daughter has my original deck. And then I bought a new one, but I didn't like the new cardstock. And so somebody was so lovely as to trade for the older cardstock. So my daughter has my original deck. But this is the same cardstock, which I love having. So this is, both of these much used. The newest Fae tarot deck, other than the Rackham and obviously the John Bauer I've been using a lot, and then a little bit of the Secret Forest, is the Children of Litha tarot. And I have a walkthrough of this as well, though I think it might have been a live unboxing. I don't know if that's even still up. I have a lot of gaps of live content that I need to think of. So I may need to do, I'll have to check and see if I need to do just like a regular, oh dear, well here's, I obviously just used this because there is a Journeyer and the Companion deck for my Shaman deck. So I use that all the time, and I use this a lot with it. So clearly I have to put that back. What I love, I'm not going to go through this much. People have heard me talk about it a lot. It's not perfect. The Three of Swords I actually end up really loving. The Emperor is a little bit rough. The Ten of Swords, the intention of the artist is to do 4 decks that use the exact same format so that you can interchange cards. Eventually, you would have 4 decks that you could interchange and sort of create your own specific deck, which I think is an amazing idea. And I'm hoping that's the case, that I can swap out. A couple of the ones like the Ten of Swords isn't my favorite, obviously, because I don't read the Ten of Swords that way. But it's, other than a couple, it is near perfection. What I love about this is that the minors are all animals. The courts are all humans in different cultures, and then the majors are definitely Fae, but certainly leaning towards the animal, shape-shifting, animal spirit kind of Faes, which I love. And so it has that powerful ancient aspect of the Fae in the majors. It has all the animal energy that is of course part of nature, and it has the human element, which is of course part of nature. And so I love the combination of those 3. So in terms of just like this overall depiction of the world, this does an absolutely amazing job for me personally. So I love this deck. So that's that. The other 2 are interesting. I don't use these a lot. Well, one is new, so I haven't used it much. I've already talked about this. I've already done a walkthrough of it, so I'm not going to belabor the point of that. This is not a typical deck that I would buy. I'm generally not into, or I don't often like decks that are just pure photo manipulation, although this is done really stunningly, I think. But it's just not my typical style of a deck. It's just not. There's no way around it. But there is something about this deck. I don't particularly think the guidebook is always helpful. Certainly the more I don't tend to use guidebooks with oracle decks, to be honest. And so I find that the statement, I don't even care about the title too much, but the statement that's at the bottom, I tend to use that statement with the image. And there's just something, it's not a Fae deck, it doesn't purport to be a Fae deck, but there is something about this deck that speaks to that liminal space that feels very Fae to me, feels very shadowy, powerful Fae to me. And I haven't used it too much. I've only used it for personal readings. I've had powerful personal readings from it. I can't really explain it or make sense out of it other than that the art is just captures that liminal space really, really well. So there's that. And then something that's similar is the Fairy Enchantments Oracle, and this is by Ian Daniels, who did the Vampire Tarot and the amazing book. Now, I don't have the Vampire Tarot anymore. Eventually, or Tarot of the Vampire, I'll probably get it back at some point. It was when I wasn't keeping any decks that I wasn't using on a regular basis, and that's not a deck I personally would use with clients. But the book, Phantasmagoria, I do think is an amazing tarot guidebook. Absolutely amazing. I do have it on an app so that I have the full book. So he created the Magic Divination cards, and apparently now there is a full, because this is what I ended up feeling about this deck. I wanted this, and you can see, look at all of my tabs. I have a walkthrough of this. He really goes into Fae energy. It's definitely Celtic Fae, what I would consider probably Celtic fairy energy here. And what I really wanted was this to be magnified. I think more so than this. So I do need to pick up, if it's still available, I have no clue. But I do need to pick up the book for this, because I actually think for me, and just my love of the tales and the power that I think resides in those tales, I think the guidebook is there. It's got the name on the back. It has sort of power symbols. It has different things to associate with it. The intention of this is that you can pick certain cards for setting intention, doing spell work, and that kind of thing. Which I did think it's a three-part process, and I did actually think that was really interesting. I just tend to do that stuff myself, picking the different things that I'm going to pick, but the artwork is very similar to Tarot of the Vampire, which is beautifully done, a little bit towards the dramatic side of things, which is what I would have said with the Tarot of the Vampire. There were some, dun, 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 like of the Fool, or I think it was the Fool. It looks like he had just got done doing a tap dance, and just a lot of blood dripping off of a vampire's mouths. Like, they're literally hundreds of years old. I truly believe that a 100-year-old vampire knows how to drink out of a cup. My children, when they were kids, drank out of cups better than some of these. So that kind of stuff does tend to me to kind of make it so I'm not as interested often. So these are really beautiful images that lean a little bit more towards that sort of dramatic, almost romance novel kind of. These are far more beautiful than a romance novel cover, but like that is stunning. So I've not really used this as an oracle deck. I might need to give it a little more of a chance with that. There's just a lot of really beautiful, again, I don't have an issue with that. Fae, I think, are probably often guise themselves in very beautiful forms, as well as some scary ones as well. But for me personally, a lot of the power, I think, of what Ian Daniels did, much like his Phantasmagoria book, it was in this little guidebook, and so I need to take a look at the bigger book. This is just really hard to read. It's small text on the black, but I just thought it was fantastic what he was doing in here. So I definitely wanted to mention that, even though it's not something that I use a lot. So that's those two. Is that everything? Woo! Whew, I think I have hit on everything. These are definitely favorites in terms of fairy oracles. These are definitely leaning towards the fairy tale. This is fairy fae, and so is this. These are fairy tale, but these are favorites. So all of these are definitely, this is Tarot of the Hidden Realms, Shadowscapes, the Children of Litha. Fairy tale wise, again, I've talked about this liminal space. There's no fairies in here. Fairy tales, John Bauer, yes, yes, and yes. Definitely the Rackham Oracle, as well as the tarot, the two Brian Frouds. I would also definitely say the Secret of the Forest. Again, haven't worked with it a lot. Definitely for the fairy aspect of things in Oracle. That fairy tale, but kind of walks the line. I just love this magical times. And I really do think for, again, that liminal space, the Circle of Life tarot, I think the only reason I don't use this as much is because it's round. And some people absolutely love round decks. This is the only deck I think I currently have that's round, other than tea leaf readings. I prefer, to be honest, like my Augenblick is a square deck. I think I prefer square decks than circles, but I think that's the only reason I don't use this as much. And I'm definitely going to give these two a go together. But these are certainly favorites of mine in the realm of what we've been talking about. I know this has been long. There's a lot of decks to roll through. I'm sure there's going to be something that I've forgotten, but I hope that this gives you a pretty good idea. And this is by far, I'm sure there are many other fairy decks out. If there is a deck that you love, that you think leans more towards the Fae side of things, aka, in the realm of this type of Fae energy, please let me know in the comments, or just any deck that you might know of that you're like, oh, she will love this. Feel free to let me know, because I would love to hear about it. So I'm going to stop, because there's just no other way to do this than to just stop talking.